Hello, I'm Vanessa from Nucleus Arts, and this is our poppy knitting tutorial for Threads of Remembrance, a community tribute for VE Day 80 in collaboration with the Historic Dockyard Chatham and supported by Medway Council. In this video I will guide you through a beginner-friendly knitting pattern from the Royal British Legion, which is also available to view on our website. Feel free to pause and replay this video as much as you need. I'm using 4mm needles with double knit yarn with red for the body and black for the centre. If you like, you could use a chunkier yarn with bigger needles for a much bigger poppy. To begin, we need to cast on 120 stitches. To do this, we need a generous length of yarn, so just under 2 meters will be fine. And then we want to make a slip knot. About 2 meters up the length. So to do this, you make a little loop and then you pull the yarn through and then catch that loop, and then this forms our first stitch and it's nice and secure, which we can then thread onto the needle. So just pull the yarn to secure it in place, not too tightly as this will make it really tricky to knit into later on. You want to make sure that your tail end yarn is at the front, so it may mean that you have to switch your slip knot around a couple of times like I've done just here. Now we need to get into position for our cast on, so with the tail end of yarn, wrap that around your thumb. And with the active yarn, which is the bit still attached to the ball, you can wrap that around your forefinger and just secure in place with the rest of your fingers. As you can see here, it looks a bit like an L shape and you've got a great bit of movement which will help with the casting on. With your right hand forefinger, you can also secure that stitch on the needle so it doesn't move around. So with our needle, we go underneath the loop we've created on our thumb and then pick it up, the loop on our forefinger, and pull it through. And that's our second cast on stitch. So again, underneath the loop on our thumb and then pick that up, the loop on the forefinger, and pull it through. We want to continue casting on these stitches until we reach 120. It may take a little bit of counting, so just take your time with it. Finally, we will have 120 stitches on the needle and it will look like this. I really recommend double checking with the counting to ensure we have 120 stitches there. With our stitches set up on the needle, we are ready to begin knitting our first row. To do a knit stitch, we need to pierce our needle through the back of the loop, which I've just done here. I'm just moving my yarn out the way because I want to make sure I'm using my active yarn. And now with that, I'm wrapping that around the needle. And then you want to hold on to that while you pull off the loop. And there we have created our first knit stitch. Make sure you don't pull it too tight, as this will make it tricky as we proceed, but let's go again. So we want to go through that loop and then wrap it round and then pull tight as you pull off onto the right needle. Again, so pierce it through, wrap it round, pull it through and pull off. And there we are creating our knit stitch, also known as a garter stitch. We will repeat this knit stitch until the end of the row, and then when this first one is completed, we will continue to knit stitch a further 3 rows. before we move on to the next step. Once you have completed that first row, simply pop the needle back into your left hand and pick up your other needle, and then simply continue knitting in for this next row. Once your first 4 rows have been knitted, they will look like this. And now we are ready to move on to the next step, which involves decreasing our number of stitches. To do this, we need to knit 3 stitches together, and we're going to do that across the row. So this can be slightly fiddly, but the premise is that instead of knitting into 1 loop, you knit into 3. So you want to get your needle and pierce through 3 loops, and the needle will come out the back, exactly how you would do a regular knit stitch, but across 3. Wrap the yarn around and then slide off. And as you can see, that has transformed 3 stitches into 1. Continue by again going into those 3 stitches through the back as you would knit them. As you can see, it is a little tricky, so just take your time with it. It may help to slide the stitches closer to the point of the needle, where it's slightly narrower and therefore there's a little more space to get the needle in. And yep, just slide off. We will continue knitting 3 stitches together for the remainder of the row, and what this is doing is it is decreasing our stitches, so we will be going from the 120 that we cast on at the beginning now to 40 stitches left on our needle. Here you can see what it looks like with the row finished and the stitches decreased to 40. And now we want to go back in with some regular knitting for another 4 rows before we move on to the next stage. Row 10, we will be decreasing stitches again, this time knitting 2 together across the row. So as we did before, this time with 2 stitches, we knit into 2, wrap around, slide off, and knit into 2, wrap around, slide off, and we will continue this for the row, meaning that we go from 40 stitches down to 20. With that decreased row complete, we now move back to standard knitting for the following 4 rows. As you can see, the poppy is really starting to take shape. Now we have finished knitting those rows, and we move on to row 15 now, which is our last row, and it is a decrease row. So again, we are knitting 2 stitches together. Now the main body of the poppy is all knitted, so we move on to the next bit, which is getting it off the needle. So to do this, I'm going to cut the yarn, leaving about 20cm tail, and then instead of casting off, I am going to thread this piece of yarn into the stitches that we have completed. Then we want to slip those stitches onto that piece of yarn. With the stitches slipped onto the yarn tail, you can then pull it tight and it will bring it round to form a circle poppy shape. Next, we will use the remaining yarn tail to match a stitch together the seam. We do this by popping the needle into the existing loops and going side to side, creating an invisible join that you won't see on the poppy. Once the seam is all stitched together, simply weave in your ends or tie them off, and then you can trim off the excess, and there is your completed poppy body. To finish things off, we of course need the black centre of the poppy. You can use a button or a piece of felt if you like. However, I will very quickly show you how you could knit something for the centre. So we pick up our black yarn and then cast on 16 stitches. With the stitches created, rather than knit the next stage, we are simply going to cast off. So in order to do this, you do actually need to do a knit stitch. So do one, and then do a second one. And then what we need to do is use our left needle to carry over that first stitch over the second one, leaving just one stitch left. So we'll repeat that. So now we've got 2 stitches, we simply pick up that loop and hook it over, and that is how we cast off. When we get to the end, you notice that we have knitted 2 stitches onto the right needle, so we simply hook over that first one, so we're left with 1, then cut the yarn and then wrap it around the needle and get that last stitch and pull it over, allowing us to pull that little bit of yarn through, and then we can pull tight, and that is our cast off piece. Coil it into a tight spiral, which will then form a nice circle centerpiece for the poppy. To help secure the shape, I use the leftover piece of yarn at the end to add a couple of stitches into the spiral, followed by a couple of stitches directly into the red poppy body, just to secure it in the centre. And finally, your knitted poppy is complete. If you would like to be included in our Threads of Remembrance installation, please drop your poppies off at Nucleus Arts Chatham, the Historic Dockyard Chatham, or any Medway library by the 31st of August 2025. We hope you enjoyed knitting your poppies, and thank you for watching.